We live in a time where sharing our thoughts, our routines, our goals, even our vulnerabilities is normalized, even encouraged. But neuroscience teaches us that not all forms of sharing are healthy and not all exposure is harmless. Today, I want to talk to you about something rarely addressed, why it's critical for your mental and physiological health not to let people know too much about you. In the realm of human interaction, our sense of safety is not only physical, but profoundly social. From a neuroscience perspective, social safety is governed by the intricate interplay between various brain regions responsible for threat detection, emotional regulation, and behavioral response. One of the core systems involved in social and processing includes the amygdala, which scans the environment and conversations for signs of danger or rejection. When we disclose personal information, especially in unfiltered or excessive amounts, we unknowingly trigger a biological system designed to assess vulnerability and threat. Disclosing information about oneself is often perceived as a sign of openness and authenticity. In moderation and in trusted environments, it can be. However, when individuals share too much too soon or with too many people, they compromise the brain's ability to maintain what's known as predictive social coding. This is the brain's mechanism for anticipating how others may react and whether the environment remains safe after information is revealed. When you tell someone something deeply personal, your brain doesn't simply move on. It enters a hypervigilant state, continually scanning for feedback, subtle facial expressions, tone of voice, body language that could indicate judgment or betrayal. This is a taxing process. It diverts neural resources away from executive functions like planning and creative thought and redirects them towards social monitoring and emotional defense. The anterior cingulate cortex, a region implicated in error detection and social pain, becomes especially active when there is a mismatch between how we expect others to treat us and how they actually do. After oversharing, any deviation from anticipated warmth or acceptance, even something as small as a delayed reply or an awkward glance, can be interpreted as a social threat. This activates stress pathways, elevates cortisol, and creates an internal feedback loop of anxiety and doubt. The social brain, particularly in situations of perceived exposure, cannot distinguish between physical and emotional threat. That's why being misunderstood, judged, or gossiped about feels not just emotionally uncomfortable, but physiologically destabilizing. In group dynamics, humans are wired to detect power balances and hierarchy. When someone discloses too much personal detail, especially in a group setting, it may shift the perceived balance. People may categorize that individual as less secure or more emotionally dependent, even if unconsciously. These shifts influence how others interact with them, speak to them, or even remember their contributions. Social neuroscience shows that people remember emotionally charged disclosures more than neutral ones. This means that once a deeply personal narrative is shared, it tends to overshadow other characteristics, skills, achievements, strengths. This isn't always fair, but it is biologically consistent. The brain encodes emotionally intense data more strongly and retrieves it more readily, which means others may recall your vulnerabilities before your values. This also ties into the concept of reputation risk. In the age of digital footprints and rapid communication, a personal detail shared in confidence can be relayed, reshaped, and reframed in minutes. The hippocampus, the region responsible for memory consolidation, stores contextual information about where and when something was said. But the recipient's brain doesn't always encode those details the same way. What you meant as a private moment might be received as casual information, retold without context, and ultimately affect how others perceive you. That loss of contextual control heightens perceived social danger, which reinforces neural circuits of withdrawal and self-manuring. Furthermore, individuals who regularly share personal information with others, especially in environments where trust hasn't been firmly established, often experience elevated baseline levels of stress. This is because the nervous system remains in a semi-activated state, anticipating repercussions or managing mental simulations of conversations that might happen next. The brain starts to create what-if scenarios, replaying interactions, or planning defenses against possible misinterpretations. This form of cognitive load is subtle but chronic, reducing our bandwidth for focus, presence, and meaningful engagement. Sharing might feel like a relief in the moment, but when it's miscalibrated, it generates a lasting tax on the mind-body system. When we talk about sharing personal information, especially in the context of modern life, it's important to understand how such behavior interacts with the brain's core systems for emotion regulation, self-identity, and environmental prediction. Oversharing, defined here as the excessive or premature disclosure of personal thoughts, feelings, or experiences, has significant neural consequences that go far beyond social awkwardness or discomfort. At the biological level, the act of revealing personal information engages networks that link the medial prefrontal cortex, amygdala, and the default mode network. These brain regions help us process self-referential information, monitor emotional relevance, and evaluate social threat. The medial prefrontal cortex is especially important in constructing and maintaining a coherent sense of self. It integrates memories, personal goals, values, and perceived social roles. When individuals engage in oversharing, especially without a clearly defined purpose or a trusted recipient, they place their self-concept under external scrutiny. This triggers what psychologists call self-conscious emotions, such as shame, embarrassment, and regret. These emotions are not arbitrary. They arise because the brain is processing an internal warning that the boundaries between internal identity and external perception have been compromised. The more personal the disclosure, the more pronounced the neural response tends to be. Another relevant system involved is the salience network, which includes the anterior insula and the anterior cingulate cortex. These regions help the brain detect what is emotionally or socially important in a given moment. When you reveal something deeply personal, especially in an unpredictable or unreceptive environment, the salience network lights up, increasing attention toward emotional cues. This amplifies your sensitivity to others' responses, real or imagined. A delayed facial reaction, a neutral tone, or even a lack of acknowledgement can register as social threat, which the amygdala processes as rejection. That emotional signal can linger in the body for hours or days, creating discomfort that feels out of proportion to the situation because it is being processed through survival brain circuits. Oversharing also interferes with the brain's predictive coding model. The human brain thrives on prediction. It builds mental models of how conversations will unfold, how people will respond, and how safe or dangerous an environment feels. When you share too much, too quickly, the brain is thrown into a reactive state. It cannot rely on past experience to predict what will happen next because the context is unfamiliar or unstable. This unpredictability is taxing for the nervous system. The more uncertain the outcome, the more stress hormones like cortisol and norepinephrine are released, elevating vigilance and reducing access to higher cognitive processes, such as problem solving and long-term planning. Moreover, the act of oversharing often bypasses the internal filters that are usually set by the prefrontal cortex. In emotionally charged states, such as anxiety or loneliness, those filters become less active. This state is known in neuroscience as hypofrontality, where the rational part of the brain goes temporarily offline, allowing raw emotional content to surface without modulation. It feels honest, even relieving at times, but the long-term effects can include regret, rumination, and a diminished sense of personal control. This is because once the emotional content is externalized, it is no longer protected by the brain's internal schema. Others can interpret, reshape, or misuse it, and the brain knows this, which is why we often feel emotionally exposed long after the conversation ends. Even the reward circuitry of the brain plays a role in oversharing. The mesolimbic dopamine system can reinforce disclosure if it initially results in social validation. A nod, a kind word, or empathetic feedback can produce a small dopamine hit, reinforcing the behavior. But this system is not good at long-term cost-benefit analysis. It responds to immediate feedback, not future consequences. The next time a similar emotional state arises, the brain remembers that disclosure led to relief or reward and encourages repetition, even if the context or recipient is inappropriate. This creates a loop of emotional impulsivity that weakens emotional boundaries over time. Trust is one of the most fundamental elements in human relationships, and the brain treats it as a dynamic process rather than a fixed state. From a neurological standpoint, trust is calibrated through a series of interactions, each providing data that the brain uses to assess safety, predictability, and reliability. When it comes to disclosing personal information, the timing and context in which that information is shared are critical. Sharing too much too soon bypasses the brain's natural calibration process and can lead to emotional dysregulation, social vulnerability, and long-term relational instability. The process of building trust involves the coordination of several neural networks, especially the prefrontal cortex, the anterior insula, and the amygdala. The prefrontal cortex is responsible for judgment, impulse control, and risk assessment. It allows us to withhold or disclose information based on the perceived trustworthiness of others. When someone shares something personal in a deliberate and measured way, the prefrontal cortex evaluates whether the recipient has earned that level of access. If the answer is yes, the act of sharing actually strengthens the relationship by engaging the brain's oxytocin system, which reinforces social bonding and emotional safety. However, when personal details are shared without establishing a foundational layer of trust, the brain experiences a conflict between emotional openness and perceived social risk. The anterior insula becomes active in these situations, registering the emotional discomfort associated with uncertainty. This region is particularly sensitive to violations of expectation, such as when a seemingly safe disclosure is met with indifference, sarcasm, or gossip. That breach of expectation doesn't just damage the relationship, it also sends a strong signal to the nervous system that future disclosures are unsafe, making the person more socially withdrawn and hypervigilant in future interactions. The amygdala, which is central to fear processing and emotional memory, also plays a role in how we recall instances of misplaced trust. When someone shares something deeply personal and it backfires, the amygdala tags that memory as a threat and stores it with heightened emotional intensity. This means that even in future relationships, the brain may generalize that experience and respond with anxiety or avoidance, even if the new environment is safer. This is why people who have experienced betrayal or ridicule after oversharing often struggle with social openness later in life. Their nervous system has adapted to protect them by suppressing vulnerability. What's important to understand is that healthy vulnerability is not about full transparency. It's about titrated disclosure, sharing small, manageable pieces of information, and then observing how others handle them. This process provides real-time feedback to the brain and strengthens or weakens trust accordingly. If the response is supportive, the prefrontal cortex adjusts its assessment and allows for slightly more openness. If the response is dismissive or predatory, the brain tightens its boundaries. This dynamic calibration ensures that disclosure serves a purpose, to deepen connection without compromising safety. The dopamine system is also implicated in this process. When someone shares something personal and is met with a validating response, dopamine is released, creating a feeling of reward and reinforcing that behavior. But when someone shares too much without this validation, or worse, is met with a negative reaction, the resulting dopamine crash can lead to feelings of shame and regret. Over time, the brain becomes less likely to associate openness with reward and begins to categorize vulnerability as a potential threat. This neurochemical feedback loop changes behavior patterns, often leading to emotional withdrawal or chronic overexposure, depending on the individual's coping style. Another relevant system in this context is the mentalizing network, which includes the temporoparietal junction and the medial prefrontal cortex. This network allows us to infer the thoughts, intentions, and emotions of others. When we engage in calibrated vulnerability, we're also engaging this network to track whether someone is empathetic, attentive, and emotionally attuned. If someone responds in a way that shows care and discretion, that social cue tells the brain it is safe to proceed. But if their response suggests disinterest, manipulation, or gossip, the brain logs that individual as unpredictable or unsafe. This mapping process continues throughout the relationship and forms the internal model of who can be trusted and to what extent. The brain is highly adaptive, constantly learning from both internal experiences and external social cues to determine how much of ourselves we should reveal in different situations. One of the less discussed but deeply relevant outcomes of oversharing is the distortion of self-perception. When we frequently externalize our inner experiences, especially in an unfiltered or emotionally reactive manner, we alter the internal narrative that defines our identity. This occurs through the brain's use of feedback loops, where external responses become integrated into our self-concept via mechanisms in the medial prefrontal cortex and the posterior cingulate cortex, both key regions involved in self-referential thinking. When personal information is shared indiscriminately or repeatedly, the emotional content of those disclosures becomes tied to external reactions. If someone consistently responds to your stories with judgment, pity, or disengagement, your brain begins to internalize those reactions as reflective of who you are. Over time, this creates a feedback loop where your sense of self is shaped more by how others react than by your own internal values or experiences. This process can slowly erode self-trust, which is the foundation for psychological resilience and autonomy. Without that self-trust, individuals are more likely to seek validation externally, which reinforces the cycle of disclosure in search of approval. Additionally, when individuals speak frequently about their struggles, weaknesses, or emotional wounds, those narratives become more deeply encoded in memory. The hippocampus, which is responsible for consolidating long-term memories, works in conjunction with the amygdala to prioritize emotionally charged content. This means that stories repeated in conversation, especially those laced with emotional intensity, are more likely to become the dominant chapters in one's mental autobiography. What you talk about consistently becomes what you think about automatically. This doesn't mean those experiences aren't valid. Rather, it highlights the brain's tendency to prioritize repeated narratives, especially those tied to vulnerability or pain, and give them greater influence in shaping identity. Another aspect of this phenomenon is known as co-rumination, which refers to the repeated discussion of problems with others, often without moving toward a solution. While it can feel bonding in the short term, co-rumination reinforces neural pathways associated with stress, anxiety, and low mood. When people share difficult emotions or stories without regulation or boundaries, they engage neural circuits that amplify emotional reactivity, including the hypothalamic pituitary adrenal HPA axis. This axis governs the body's stress response, and when activated too frequently through emotionally charged sharing, can dysregulate mood and impair sleep, digestion, and cognitive clarity. In social neuroscience, there's a principle called mirroring that plays a critical role in how people respond to disclosure. When we share something personal, especially with emotional intensity, the listener's mirror neuron system activates to simulate our internal state. If someone responds with discomfort, awkwardness, or distancing, our brain interprets those nonverbal cues as rejection or disapproval, even if it's subtle. These micro reactions accumulate over time and influence the disclosur's internal model of social safety. They might become overly self-critical, uncertain about when or how to share, or develop an inflated sense of how negatively others perceive them. Oversharing also impacts decision-making by shifting focus away from long-term goals and toward immediate emotional relief. The ventromedial prefrontal cortex, which is involved in balancing emotion and logic in decision-making, becomes skewed when disclosures are made in the heat of emotion. What feels like getting it off your chest in the moment often results in emotional hangovers later, where the person replays what they said, how it was received, and what the social consequences might be. This reflective loop, mediated by the brain's default mode network, can increase anxiety and self-consciousness, reducing the ability to stay present and grounded. The chronic externalization of personal experience also leads to a dilution of boundaries. Psychological boundaries are critical for maintaining a coherent sense of self, and they're enforced by consistent patterns of thought, behavior, and self-regulation. When someone habitually shares without discretion, the distinction between what is internal and what should remain protected becomes blurred. Over time, this undermines the structural integrity of self-definition, making individuals more reactive, more dependent on external input, and less capable of internal emotional regulation.